Now I'm going to use the words mentally retarded in the talk because those are the words, the historic words, because it's too confusing to use developmentally challenged, developmentally disabled, and all the modern euphemisms, right? So I'm going to use the words that we use then because this is what the book's about, right? And they also were not necessarily like pejorative words in those days. They were just words they used, like when you say, well, I'm a diabetic. Like, we don't see that as putting me down that I'm a diabetic, because the word is telling you something about my medical condition. Well, that's how they looked at it, right? Mentally retarded was a medical term. It wasn't necessarily a term of a put-down. So there's that big cultural difference of how we look at these words today and how they were looked at in the early 1900s when they were developed. Dr. William Serson had been the medical doctor on duty that day in the new infirmary where Daisy, at first admission under the guardianship of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, had been held with other girls in the isolation ward until the assessments were finished. The old infirmary, where Daisy's mother, Ella, and other Hewitt relatives, as well as her father's sister, had been kept decades before, stood further down the slope on the institution grounds, unknown to Daisy. It was occupied now by the overflow of patients from other cottages, for the population of the Aurelia institution had reached almost 3,000 by 1959, so it's now 1959. Dr. Serson sifted quickly but decisively through Daisy Lumsden's documents, including Daisy's 2 signed physician's certificates of incompetence, as per Section 12 of the Mental Hospitals Act, that had been forwarded from the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital. The certificate or certificates, when accompanied by the forms mentioned in subsection 1 of Section 20, shall be sufficient authority to any person to convey the patient to the institution and detain him or her therein. Another member of this family for you, and who knows how many more there are in the hospital, the psychiatrist Dr. Edmonds at the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital had written in the accompanying note to Dr. Serson. The Lumsdens and the Hewitts, between them, had produced apparently at least 22 retarded children, which meant Daisy was the 3rd generation designated retarded. 3 generations mentally retarded. Dr. Serson frowned. Both sides of the family affected, though the parents were not blood relations, the psychologist at TPH had commented under family history. Mr. Goody, the psychologist at Aurelia, had been most interested in the genetic aspect of the case and had drawn up a family tree of Daisy's relatives, going back to the patient's great-grandmother, who had been an inmate at Rainhill Asylum in Liverpool, in England. This tree was still in Daisy's file. There was no end to the degeneracy of this family. The Lumsdens were all backward or mentally deficient. On the maternal side, the patient's mother, Ella Lumsden, née Hewitt, an imbecile and potential arsonist in childhood, had been a patient in the Hospital for the Feeble-Minded Aurelia in 1937, along with her brothers and an illegitimate nephew. Daisy's mother's older sister, Henrietta, had had an illegitimate son at age 16 named Cuthbert, who was now placed in the Aurelia Hospital for the Feeble-Minded by the Toronto Children's Aid Society at age 6. An incorrigible child by all reports, he had bit the teacher in the backward class at Jarvis School and called her a sod. Cuthbert Hewitt was still in Aurelia, in his 20s now, a patient in Cottage B for low-grade males, something that Daisy Lumsden need not know, of course. Dr. Serson and Dr. Brillinger, his colleague, agreed. As to the rest of the Hewitts, the Toronto Social Service Index had put out a call for information on them, to check up on them. They had been in the backward vocational classes. Mr. Gooding, the psychometrist, assessed Daisy's IQ at 54, which meant mid-moron level. So she was a moron, even though at one point the psychologist at the Children's Aid Society, had given Daisy a score of 66, but that had been when she was 5. And Dr. Stansted at the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital had given Daisy a score of 62 on the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scales, when Daisy was 7.5. Mr. Gooding seemed not to notice the discrepancy in these results, the dramatic drop in Daisy's performance, or make any allowance for a child in shock over the journey from Toronto, over the affront of an intimate physical examination on arrival, and of finding herself cast in a new life in an institution in the middle of nowhere. Daisy had been too frightened she would fall off the narrow examining table to cry out as she lay with her feet in the stirrups, legs apart. "This won't take a minute." "They brought you into a room in isolation in the infirmary, Thelma, with other girls. Oh, there was about 7 of us," Daisy recalled to me. "Then they told you to undress for the physical. You were to line up in a straight line and step forward when your name was called, girls and boys separate. They put their hands and fingers all over you, in your ears, in your mouth, up your vagina, everywhere. You lay on your back on a table. You are to open your mouth wide and say, 'Ah,' and be weighed on a scale and measured. Their hands was all over your breast, squeezing. Mine was small. I was just a kid of 12, nearly 13, she said. What right did they have to do that? I was just a kid." Physical completed, 11:45 a.m., the report stated. She'd been given the usual mandatory tub bath, her hair shorn. Short, stumpy tufts now stuck out from her head down to her ears. She was ugly now, she remembered. She remembered crying after her hair was shorn, to stop nits and lice, they had said. "I want to go home, I want to go home to Mommy and Dada," she'd wept. And they'd laughed and said, "Your parents are no good. You've been taken away from them, and that's why you're here." And I cried all the harder.